Now, despite all of that, I still say that word definitions can, they do, and they will change over time. Therefore, the word Satan today means a guy who's stationed down in the middle of the earth, torturing poor souls with flames for eternity. Does it mean that this has always been the word's meaning for all of time? That is, was it at least the meaning during Jesus' day? Now, that's one of the questions I would like to explore in this chapter. However, and do know this, the teaching of a literal personal devil, or Satan, was being taught during Jesus' day. It was. So that's not what I'm meaning. I mean, was it the actual teachings of Jesus and his apostles who taught differently than other Jewish religious sects of that time? Now we got another explanatory note called Who Taught Differently Than Other Jewish Religious Sects at That Time. What I'm about to get into concerning the first century Jewish beliefs is not my own assessment, but is well documented online and in books, though not everybody will agree with the conclusions. However, and even though I'm not forcibly saying that the Jewish religious sects of Jesus' day were influenced by other worldly religions, even though I'm certainly suggesting it anyway, I really am saying all this based on the way that the scriptures themselves been. That is, other than the Apocrypha, which in my opinion is not true scripture. Now, on a side note, and concerning the Apocrypha, because I know that a lot of my listeners are not going to understand exactly what that is. Now, the basic sense of the Apocrypha is that it's a set of books that were Jewish men wrote them starting sometime after Malachi, that is the ending of the Old Testament, and not just through the times of Christ, but they extend actually after the time of Christ as well. Now, because of their antiquity, that is, of how old they are, a lot of people are of the opinion that they are part of scriptural canon. In my opinion, they are not. But during this video, I'm not going to speak about the Apocrypha in great detail, but to show the idea of Satan is more heavily illustrated in the Apocrypha than it is in what has become as accepted canon, especially in the Protestant Bible, the modern King James Bible. I say modern because in the 1611 King James Version, when it first came out, the part of the Apocrypha was included in the original 1611. They, because of Protestants, Puritans in England, it eventually made its way out. So in the 1769 version that I had talked about in the last video, the Apocrypha was completely removed. But also in the Catholic Bible, there's even more apocryphal books added to that. Now, what I'm going to do is, after this video, because I'm going to express some things about the Apocrypha, but after this video, I am going to give a short history on the Apocrypha, so that way the listener can completely understand what all that's about, because it's important to understand because of where a lot of our history of Satan comes from is from the Apocrypha. So stay tuned for that next video. Also, I want to point out that a lot of the first century Jewish beliefs, just prior to Christ coming, a lot of it was based on apocryphal teachings, as we're going to continue to see. And that's why when Jesus and his apostles come later on, what they had to say was a lot different. And with how several of these sects' beliefs really differed from what Jesus had taught. Let's go to Matthew 22, verses 23 through 29. This is just a summary. The same day came to him the Sadducees, which say that there's no resurrection. And they asked him, let's go down to verse 29. Jesus answering, he said unto them and to the Sadducees, You do err, you're in error, not knowing, not understanding the scriptures, nor the power of God. See, they didn't always understand it. Now, let's go to a Wikipedia quote for the Second Temple period. I got the address here if you want to look it up. The Second Temple period in Jewish history lasted between 516 BC and 70 AD, when the Second Temple of Jerusalem existed. The sects of the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and early Christianity were formed during this period. The Second Temple period ended with the First Jewish-Roman War and the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple. That is from spring AD 67 until August AD 70. Now let's jump over to the Wikipedia page on Satan. Wikipedia on old Jewish beliefs of Satan. During the Second Temple period, when the Jews were living in the just look at it on here. I can't pronounce that. This empire, Judaism was heavily influenced by there's another word right there. The religion of those guys. Jewish conceptions of Satan were impacted by Angra Mainya, the Zoroastrian god of evil, darkness, and ignorance. The idea of Satan as an opponent of God and a purely evil figure seems to have taken root in Jewish pseudepigrapha, i.e., the Apocrypha, during the Second Temple period, particularly in the Apocalypse. Now, all these big fancy words in this quote, in my actual book that I'm reading from, I get into detail of the history of each of these things that I have named. But for time's sake, I won't go over it here. I don't very often do this to where I don't read every single thing that's in my book. But for the flow of this to go very well, I just think it best to get on past it. You can always look it up yourself if you want to get very nitty-gritty with this. But the most important part of this quote that I want to point out is where it says, and I'll repeat it here on the screen, the idea of Satan as an opponent of God and purely evil figure seems to have taken root in Jewish pseudepigrapha, the Apocrypha, which again, I don't think is scripture, during the Second Temple period, particularly in the Apocalypse. But let's continue on. The Jewish Encyclopedia, the unedited full text of the 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia Online. I got the address for you here on his article on Satan. The evolution of the theory of Satan keeps pace with the development of Jewish angelology and demonology. In Wisdom 2:24, this is an apocryphal book now, he is represented with reference to Genesis chapter 3 as the author of all evil, who brought death into the world. He's apparently mentioned also in Ecclesiasticus, Sirach, another apocryphal book. And the fact that his name does not occur in Daniel is doubtless due merely to chance. Satan was a seducer and the paramour of Eve, as was hurled from heaven together with other angels because of his iniquity. Again, this is from an apocryphal book, not the Bible. Symbolic Book of Enoch. Since that time, he has been called Satan, although previously has been termed Satanel. The doctrine of the fall of Satan, as well as the fall of the angels, is found also in Babylonia, Shrouded or whatever, not the Bible. It's mentioned several times, though, in the New Testament. Satan rules over an entire host of angels. Martyrdom of Isaiah, apocryphal books. Mastema, who induced God to test Abraham through the sacrifice of Isaac, that's found in the Bible, is identified with Satan in both name and nature from the book of Jubilees, not the Bible. And the Asmodeus of the book of Tobit, also in the Apocrypha, is likewise to be identified with him, especially in view of his licentious, just look at it on here. As a lord of Satan's, he not infrequently bears the special name of Samuel. It is difficult to identify Satan in any other passage of the Apocrypha, since the originals in which his name occurred have been lost, and the translations employ various equivalents. An augmentum a silitio, I think that's Latin, cannot therefore be adduced as proof that concepts of Satan were not widespread, but it must rather be assumed that reference to him and his realm is implied in the mention of evil spirits of every sort. Now, this last entry from the 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia, very important to understand. Again, I'm referencing about the Apocrypha here. That despite their historical importance, we should not read them with doctrinal purity in the very same light as we would read the sacred canon of the Old and the New Testaments. For what's actually considered sacred has nothing to do with the age of a book, but that it was either written by or dictated by an ordained prophet or an apostle of God. Not only, but none of the Apocrypha were ever quoted by either Jesus or his apostles in the New Testament. That's important to understand. So, if we don't consider them doctrinally friendly, we should really relook at the actual canon's words and see if they even match up with the Apocrypha's doctrine. Or even, and perhaps more especially, with modern Christian doctrines who actually believe in a spirit being called the devil. These apocryphal books in question were indeed written by Jewish men. Therefore, it's not really a hard conclusion or to at least consider that their first century AD religious outlook may have indeed been influenced by outside pagan religions for their beliefs which differed from Jesus and his followers. Leaning on such sources as Fallen Angels, Soldiers of Satan's Realm, Bambier Bernard J. 2006, Oxford Dictionary of Jewish Religion, 2011, the Jewish Encyclopedia, which I had just quoted above from 1906, the Book of Job in Medieval Jewish Philosophy, 2004, Dictionary of Jewish Terms, A Guide to the Language of Judaism, Robert L. Einsberg, 2004, Breath of Life, God as Spirit in Judaism, Rabbi Rachel Timner, 2011, The Dictionary of Angels, Gustav Davidson, 1967, and etc. Wikipedia comes up with this conclusion concerning modern thoughts of Satan based on modern Judaism. So let's go back to Wikipedia, back to the page on Satan. And they say, most Jews do not believe in the existence of a supernatural figure, that is, the devil. Traditionalists and philosophers of medieval Judaism adhere to rational theology, rejecting any belief in rebel or fallen angels and viewing evil as abstract. The rabbis usually interpreted the word Satan as it used in the Tanakh as referring strictly to human adversaries and rejected all of the Enochian writings mentioning Satan as a literal heavenly figure from the biblical canon, making every attempt to root them out. Nonetheless, the word Satan has occasionally been metaphorically applied to evil influences, such as the Jewish exegesis of the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Rabbinical scholarship on the book of Job generally follows the Talmud and Maimonides, in identifying the Satan from the prologue as a metaphor for the Yetzer Hara and not an actual entity. Satan is rarely mentioned in Tannaitic literature, but is found in Babylonian Aggadah. Each modern sect of Judaism has its own interpretation of Satan's identity. Excuse me. Conservative Judaism generally rejects the Talmudic interpretation of Satan as a metaphor for the Yetzer Hara and regard him as a literal agent of God. But though very interesting, and though this shows us, like Christianity, there are different outlooks on certain religious issues from the Jews, how do we as Christians look at Satan's role, both in the Bible and in our everyday lives? Despite the seemingly traditional forwarded meanings by Strong's dictionaries, which I quoted at the beginning of this chapter, I really do want to dig a lot deeper. For as I've mentioned, Strong's is not wrong with its meanings, it just has added meanings because it could not be helped to have new ones added therein. For surely the devil is another meaning for the word Satan because tradition demands it. However, and as I hope to show herein, adversary should really be the only meaning applied to all relevant verses in the Bible that mention Satan. That is, the word's actual original meaning. And we'll learn this not by historic observation, but by scriptural deciphering.